Hello, readers, and welcome to an interview with Rich Vreeland. Rich is more commonly known as Disasterpeace, and he's the audio producer behind Fez, The Floor's Jelly, Famaze, and plenty of other great games. His latest project, Monsters Ate My Birthday Cake, released a couple months ago. Rich, how are you?
I am great. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Now, you've worked on a variety of games ranging from Shoot Many Robots, which, for those of you who aren't aware of this game, is they got the premise of hillbillies hunting robots, to Hyper Light Drifter, which is a darker game centered around a protagonist who's trying to find a cure for this horrible disease that's ravaging his body. Now, obviously, these games have very different soundtracks. How do you decide the tone of the music for the games that you're involved in?
Yeah, it's definitely not a one-step process. There's a lot of factors that go into it. There's a lot of back and forth dialogue between myself and the developers about the game, about the aesthetic, about the goals. And then there's typically a process where I go into my lair and cook up some musical ideas for a bit. On Shoot Many Robots, most of my music concepts were done on the guitar because that turned out to be a logical aesthetic to move into. So on that note, a lot of the ideas came out of acoustic guitar riffs and things like that. But more recently, I've done a lot of concept work on my music at the piano, and that's been in parallel with purchasing a piano, which was a nice thing to have, and practicing quite a bit and trying to get better at that.
So when do you typically join a project? Do you like to see a playable build before committing, or are you usually on board with very early concept ideas?
Typically, I join a project after the initial early concept period. I'll usually join right around the time. Well, I'll join in name sometimes before the actual builds are out and stuff. But when I like to get down to the nitty gritty is usually around the time that the first playable builds are coming through. There's a lot of concept work that can be done before that, as far as establishing tone and aesthetic and things like that. But that only gets me so far, and being able to play the game in a state that's somewhat far along allows me to make more informed decisions about everything, and especially about how the music behaves and the relationship of the music with the game, and the artwork and all the other elements.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, one thing I'm interested in is your most recent game, Monsters Ate My Birthday Cake, which just released a couple months ago for both the computer and mobile devices, recently had an audio update that added several new songs. Is this something that you're planning on doing in the future, or was it just for this particular game?
Yeah, that was definitely a one-time situation. Ideally, I like to finish my work in time for the game to come out, but in this particular case, I had a lot of things going on and fell a little bit behind schedule. And as the game released and I was playing it and everything, I was not totally happy with the amount of material in the game, and I decided to go back and spend the next month writing a bunch of music. So when the game came out, there's about 15 minutes of music, and a month later, when this big release came out, we quadrupled the amount of music to an hour, and yeah, that felt nice.
Yeah, I actually didn't realize it was quite that significant of an update.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were. So for the initial 15 minutes, that music really covered that really covered the bare bones, the bare essentials for music in a game. Basically, there was music in all the places that there needed to be music, but there was very little variety. So what was happening was that here's this game that takes a few hours to play through, and you've only got 15 minutes of music. That's like one song per 20 levels and situations like that. So it was putting a lot of putting a lot of demand on each of those pieces of music. So I really thought it was important to flesh out the variety of music in the game quite a bit, and that's what I did. There are a lot of tangential levels and side content in the game, and I went out and created unique music for all of those, which definitely helped a lot, and then also created alternate versions and new tracks to use for the main line through the game. So overall, the amount of that was expected from each track went way down. So I think now the game plays a lot better. The funny thing, of course, is that like in the reviews for the game, I don't think anybody mentioned the music being repetitive. So this may just be for me and for the audio people, but I don't think that these things necessarily need to be noticed for them to be appreciated. So I think I'll just keep doing what feels right.
I'm sure fans who buy the OST will also be very appreciative.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a much better bargain.
Definitely. Now I have a few questions about The Floor is Jelly, which is my personal favorite soundtrack of what you've worked on. And I just start off by saying I love how the music transitions from this incredibly relaxing, soothing atmosphere to highly stressful. How did you go about designing the songs to match the stages?
Yeah, there's a clear arc in that game where in the beginning the levels are very naturalistic, and then at some point things start to get pretty abstract, and when you reach this world that's in outer space, you start to encounter glitches, and from there on there is a lot of glitching going on in the game, and I tried to capture that in the music as well. So I would say that the approach for that was a twofold approach. There's the idea of capturing the emotional quality of the levels. So in the early stages of the game, most of that takes place outside, on a sunny day or at night, on a quiet night with some crickets, or in a rainstorm. And all the music in those places tries to capture the emotional content, what the player might feel in those. So some of the early stuff is more laid back. It's some of it is happy. The rain music is very melancholy. So that's one facet of it, and then the other facet is trying to mimic the physical aspect of those levels. So a great example is the music in the rain levels, where the music actually mimics the physical manifestation of rain. So you have raindrops hitting surfaces, which creates all this pitter patter, all these little plinks, and the music seeks to do the same thing. So all the musical notes will pitter patter in a very similar fashion, and then this carries on through the later stages where in outer space things are big and quiet at times, and then build up, and when you encounter glitches in the game, the music starts to glitch as well, and this carries through to the final level, which if you've played The Floor is Jelly, is is totally insane. It's one of the most bizarre gameplay experiences I can think of, and the music is pretty weird too. So I think I accomplished what we set out to do with that.
You touched on a couple of the other questions I was going to ask, and one of them was that you mentioned the space section. And anyone who's played The Floor is Jelly is aware that when you enter this space, you have a brief moment of complete silence until you pick up a certain item. Why did you decide to include just complete silence in one of the levels?
Yeah, for space, the silence idea was something that I toyed with a little bit in Fez. So in the end, in one of the last levels of Fez, you're in essentially an outer space, and there's no sound effects, there's no Foley. Everything is just underscore, and I really liked the way that felt with the low, well, zero gravity essentially. Well, it wasn't zero gravity, but pretty low gravity. Anyway, that feeling of floating, it added, not having sound, it really added a heaviness to that experience, and I found that felt very appropriate for the space world in The Floor is Jelly. So that's, the hub world, the center of that world is where you experience that feeling. But as you move through these different trajectories of the world, you hear these different sections of music that all have the same arc, which is that the music starts very, very subtle, almost like just a really low tone or like a rumble, and then as you progress closer and closer to this item that you need to collect, that music rises and gets more twinkly, I suppose. And then by collecting those items, you're actually screwing up the level. You're glitching the crap out of everything. So once that happens, the music switches over into this really glitched out version of itself, and then you have to move back to the hub world, and that journey back is musically very similar to the journey there. But instead of starting quiet and building up to the item, and then like that, you start at the item and it's already built up, and then as you move away from the item, it gets really, really, really quiet until you get to the hub and it's silence again. So when you play through that world, you experience that arc 3 separate times. So yeah, I thought that worked on a couple of levels. It worked to mirror the natural environment, having the space in the center, but also the fact that in the hub there's nothing really there to interact with. So the music doesn't do anything, but then as you get closer to those items, the music starts to pick up.
The other thing you mentioned a bit earlier is that you said how you tried to model the music off of what was happening in the stages. So the rain stages, you said that the music had a lot of plinks. But besides that, you also went ahead and you actually made excellent use of actual atmospheric sounds like rain and splashing water. Why did you decide to add sounds to the game's songs as opposed to keeping them purely musical?
Yeah, I felt that the environmental sounds, they really added a lot to the experience, and they helped to glue it all together. So when I was creating the soundtrack to release separately, I felt like some of the songs were bare without those. So I included them, and I think the soundtrack works better because of that.
And then finally, just going off that a little bit, at one of the stages, well, I guess it's several stages, you can duck underwater, and doing so muffles the music in an interesting way. How did you create that effect?
That effect it's all baked into the music files that we're using in the game. So when you're above ground, there are no added effects. And then when you go underwater, there's some additional musical elements that are added, but there's also reverb and probably delay, filtering, and and just sonic shaping to create a different environment. But to have those two tracks be existing in parallel so that you can crossfade between them seamlessly. And then of course the actual crossfade happens when you hit the water and you start to go under, and that crossfade is masked by sound effects, the sound of your character splashing into the water, and together that hopefully creates a cohesive experience.
Well, that about does it for the floor is jelly. Thanks for humoring me on all those questions.
Yeah,
but the next thing I'm going to go in a bit on is Famaze. And Famaze is probably not one of your most well-known games, so I'll just briefly summarize it here for people who haven't heard of it. It's a free roguelike created by Oryx Games, in which you have almost a Nintendo DS-like split between what's happening on the bottom screen, which refers to your combat and picking up items, and the top screen, which is your map navigation. But anyway, back to the more important part of this, the game's music. And while I really enjoyed the game's music, I noticed that it only seems to play about half the time. Why did you decide to include such large gaps between the songs?
Yeah, that was a choice that I made consciously. I wanted to do something different with this project. I think overall the project didn't really turn out the way that we wanted it to. It took a long time to finish. There was a lot of personnel changes and political problems, and the list really goes on. But the game that we did end up with, I think, is still pretty good. And musically, I should say that the experience of playing the game really breaks down into these two distinct sections. The first half of any level is you as the character moving through the maze, interacting with objects, fighting enemies. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to find a key which will allow you to open a door and progress to the next level. So that's the first half, and then the second half is once you get the key, you have to find a way out. So I really wanted to tap into that idea with music, and the way that we did that is that each level, which has a unique art set and environment, but is procedurally generated. So each of those levels has its own theme song. They usually last about a minute and 15 seconds or so, and then they wither away slowly. And then typically the player will, in some cases they will have already found the key, other cases they'll still be looking, and so they won't hear any music for a bit, maybe 5-10 minutes in some cases. But once they find the key, the music picks up again, and you hear character music. So you can play as 3 different characters in Famaze. You can play as a warrior, you can play as a rogue, or a wizard, and each of those characters has a theme song, and those are much longer. Those are generally about 3 minutes long, and that piece is supposed to represent the journey that you've just been on, and some kind of dopamine receptor, like a reward for getting the key, and now that you're going to progress to the next level. So I really wanted to explore this totally different way of, not totally different, but just something that might be a little more interesting than having a loop, especially when you're dealing with a procedural level where the amount of time it takes to play through that level can vary greatly, and looping music can get repetitive very quickly. So all in all, I think the system works as intended, and it works well. The one area where I think it would be more effective is if we added environmental sounds into the game, so that when the music dies away, you're not left with no environmental sounds at all. And because that can feel a little strange at times, and I think that would have been a nice addition. That would have been a nice glue to really, marry everything to each other.
One thing you touched upon there was the 3 playable characters, and each has a specific theme. I thought that was an interesting idea. One thing I noticed about it, though, is that it sort of adds a music exclusivity. If you choose the knight, you don't get to hear the thief's theme. So why did you decide to go that route and limit some of the music for the game?
I don't think of it as a limitation. I actually like the idea of music exclusivity, just like I like the idea of gameplay exclusivity, Easter eggs, side content, anything that's non-essential. I think those things add depth to the world of an experience, and it can help create the illusion of a never-ending place, which is, I think, can be helpful. I would say in this case, it's not so much that, it's just it just happens to be an added incentive to try the other characters. Not that someone would know that right off the bat, but if they did try a second character, they would realize, and then they might be inclined to try the third as well. This approach, though, it doesn't always make sense. I mean, if there were like 30 characters, I'd probably have to take a different approach, because 3 minutes.
That's a lot of music.
That's a lot of music for me to write for a pretty small game. So but in this case, there's only 3 characters, so I didn't mind having a little bit of exclusivity there.
And now I'm going to ask you a question on a game that I imagine most of my readers are very interested in. Hyper Light Drifter. I saw a Twitter update from you a couple days ago that said, figured out the theme for Hyper Light Drifter on the piano today. It's some Gilgamesh level stuff. Feels good, man. So that makes me feel pretty great. What kind of music can we expect to find in this game?
It's going to be... Well, there's some of it floating around already. There's a combat video on YouTube that has some very atmospheric synthesizer music, and there will certainly be a lot of synthesizers on this score. There will be some overlap with Fez, but it's going to have a different character to it. It's definitely going to be a darker, more rounded sound, more analog in a way. And I'm also exploring using thematic material more heavily than I did in previous projects like Fez. I mean, Fez has a couple of themes, but they only get used sparingly, and I'd like to try to focus more on that, because I think it's an interesting challenge, and I think it has a lot of benefits to the overall experience. And Hyper Light Drifter is going to have some different modes that will play out very differently, and I'm going to approach the music very differently for those areas. Some areas will be more like side content that's replayable, and those will have more energetic music, most likely. And then the music for the campaign will be... I've written some of it already, and it's very cinematic. A lot of it is kind of... I've been spending a lot of energy trying to get into the right headspace to create music for this game, and a lot of the music is turning out to be very, very impressionistic in a way, very, very much inspired by composers like Ravel and Satie and Debussy and stuff like that. So yeah, you can expect some cool stuff.
All right, well, one last question and I will let you go here. What advice would you give for someone hoping to get into the production of video game music?
I would say that you got to be yourself. You got to really lean into the things that compel you, the things that drive you. But you also have to try stuff and make mistakes, and it's all part of the experience and the journey of getting to where you might want to go. And that journey doesn't have to end, anytime soon. There's always turnover. There's always things changing. It's a constant back and forth listening process to yourself. And outside of that, as far as more I guess more business related advice would be to be visible, to go to public facing events, go to conferences, go to meetups in your area if you're fortunate enough to have some of those. And if not, there are game jams, which are a great way to meet game developers and to work on games with little to no overhead. And if you live out in the not the boondocks, if you live out in the sticks, basically, the internet happens to be there, and there are a lot of internet centric game jams. Ludum Dare is a good one. So yeah, the world is your oyster.
Rich, thank you so much for stopping by.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And readers, if you enjoyed the interview, remember to like Literary Video Games on Facebook or follow me at Literary Gaming on Twitter. Rich, thanks again, and I will see all of you next time.